Okay, so we're about a minute ahead, but I'm just going to start with a brief introduction to talk a little bit about the context of today's webinar or WebEx meeting. Transitioning Title III into totally from the UCA and the DMI into the Utah Grants Management System was a very intentional approach to trying to think more strategically about how resources, and we don't mean just funds, but the way in which resources are allocated and programs are evaluated for their effectiveness based on the actual data of the students who are English learners. So at the last ALS meeting, Ogden gave a really great example of looking at their data and identifying the lack of progress at grades 5 and 6. And typically what we've seen in our own historical data, and that's why we're making it more differentiated, is that in upper elementary, it's really critical that students make progress before they hit middle school, because there are so many issues related to what happens when they're in early adolescence and when they're transitioning to a different learning environment, and the levels of stress and anxiety that mitigate the kind of progress that's necessary for students to then have access to early college coursework, more rigorous work in relationship to content vocabulary. So the reason the change is to really develop the capacity of the local education agency to monitor their own growth and progress and the processes, procedures, and policies that they use, and then have a place in the grants management system to keep all those documents for, whenever there are monitoring visits from either legislators who are very interested in the progress of English learners, because it is now a key component, if a school has 10 English learners, is a key component for school grades based on 9% of the allocated weight for grades. So this is just a really incredibly strategic time and an opportunity in the history of Utah's educational endeavors and commitment to English learners, and to ensuring that kids not only are proficient in English, but they have access to grade level content in math, science, and English language arts, and the implications for that in focusing on the benefit of being literate in the heritage language, as well as the dual immersion programs and the biliteracy seal for students. So all of these things that are really significant in creating economic opportunity for the future of our children is really what we're looking at. So this is not just another hoop, but it's really an attempt to scaffold the way in which we evaluate the effectiveness of language programs to support students who are immigrants, refugees, and other students in multilingual communities. So we're going to look at some specific exemplars from the actual applications. We're just going to focus on the applications. The next webinar, we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of documentation, exemplars, and documenting the monitoring tool, and kind of the criteria based on if you actually have an LEA that has a handbook related to ELs, just like the tool that's the spending handbook that will be updated and put on the USBE website. you'll be able to identify the page numbers, and then if you have handouts or you have links on the website, you put that into your document. So everything is monitored and you have evidence for your actual practices. So let's look at the questions in the actual application. And I'm just giving you some exemplars and then making comments about them. It'll only be a half an hour because I'm going to actually send out these exemplars so that you can have them and analyze them and compare them with your own work and see what you want to do in relationship to your own context. Okay, so the first question is, explain how your LEA is using student data, specifically the 5 ESSA reporting indicators in the self-assessment tool, to evaluate the effectiveness of your language instruction program. Now remember, you're actually explaining how you're using student data based on those indicators to evaluate the effectiveness of your language program. So the reason this is important is that we're linking the monitoring tool, the assessment tool, and the actual report card that is coming out and will be made public sometime in December, but to the LEAs, I think, within the next week, for you to look at the specific data. So let's look at sample 1. This is from a charter school. So the educators say, upon receipt of state accountability data, our district team will determine specific needs for EL student growth, for language growth and proficiency, and for content growth and proficiency. Now, the reason this distinction is really important is because they're looking at the individual student growth goals, right, toward proficiency, and also growth goals toward proficiency based on where they are now. So this is done with our ALS team, our testing department, teaching and learning department. Our ALS team meets weekly to discuss our data, services, and school needs, as well as ESSA and the new requirements. We meet with the teaching and learning department to look at the data. We'll establish growth targets and proficiency goals across the district. A variety of data will be connected and analyzed. Now, the thing that's interesting about this, just to be really perfectly clear, in the ESSA plan, the actual annual growth goals toward English proficiency is being set by the state. So if you're developing goals, you would calibrate it to where each of your students need to be based on when they entered the school system, and so what grade level and what language proficiency level they were assessed at. So that's a piece that's very crucial in, identifying and differentiating more support for English learners, and then being very skillful in working with counselors and teachers to develop those kind of individual plans with the parents that really support the students and the family in understanding the annual growth goals for the student. So the school goes on, the charter school goes on and says, using the data that we have been able to access so far, Okay, now they're talking, the reason why this is such an impressive approach is, they're talking about the data that they do have. And they're talking about their plans for when they actually get the state data on the school report cards, you see. So it's obvious by this response that they're very clear that they're not just waiting around for the state data, but they're already making decisions. So using the data that we already are able to access, and this is what they've done. Though we are working hard to provide effective instruction for our EL students, the data that we can access shows that we are not meeting state standards and goal targets for language or the end-of-the-year content assessments for our ELs. We are working to provide improved professional development for improved instruction. Other efforts that we are making are outlined below. Okay, so they're pretty clear about what trends they've already indicated they've seen with their students. And as a consequence, these are the actions they're taking because based on the evaluation, they're changing what they're doing. So regarding professional development, we've begun a 30-minute modules for PD for teachers after they have 14 hours or they've actually done the 14 hours. A coaching piece is included wherein a coach works with the teacher to implement the content in their classes for 4 hours. We also provide instruction to individual schools according to their needs. Our ELD leads meet quarterly to receive instruction and support regarding strategies to improve instruction for ELs. They return to their schools and provide PD there. Okay, then it says, in an effort to increase proficiency in English and also increase growth, we provided curriculum to our ELD teachers, and in the same effort, we've identified an ELD lead in every school. So what they're doing is they're building the capacity, which is really, really critical, the local capacity. And then they focus on this data-informed activities by looking historically at their data. And they're being like perfectly honest and clear. It's not like they're covering up anything because they know the more they can identify what the issues are, then the better they are positioned to use resources to support the students that need those resources to make growth toward proficiency and also achieve proficiency at grade level with grade level content. So it says, our data also showed that ELs are overrepresented in special ed. We have worked to address this for 4 years by establishing a consultation process. Teams that want to refer an EL student for special ed must provide data to our specialists who ensure appropriate interventions. Then they go on to talk about their grades K through 5, about 12% of ELs are in special ed, and 6 through 12, about 18. It appears this process is lowering the number of ELs going into special ed, which is, a huge issue. Then they also focus on chronic absenteeism, and they focus on tracking attendance. They contact families to support them in making decisions. They've raised their graduation rates from 41% in 2012 to 72% in 2017. I believe that the Diploma Now program that we have, and this is from West Jordan High School, is partially responsible for the improvement. So they're doing attributions in relationship to how they're tracking graduation of English learners. 72% is quite high. The average in Utah for English learners is about 65%, 66, 67%, which is the lowest of any student group. The reason this is significant is there are some districts where their graduation for English learners is 86%, 83%, and a graduation rate for English learners that's not only the highest in Utah, but also in the country. So really the focus of learning together is important, and that's why the way in which we do monitoring visits is to recognize really exemplary teaching and then practices within the LEAs that support changes to ensure English learners have equitable access and the kind of support that they need. Now here's sample 2. And remember what the question is. The question is, how are you using data to evaluate the effectiveness of your language programs? So this LEA is like incredibly systematic. They're very detailed, they're very systematic, and they're very clear about which groups they're working with. So schools have reviewed the access data between 17 and 18, and of course they're doing that because of the recalibration of the standards. So they're not going beyond that, which I think is really important for you to understand. This is hard since all the data has to be done by hand at the time. And the reason they're saying that is we haven't actually gotten that data We've gotten some of it, but it's not as effective because it's not by school, which the school report card will then provide for us. Overall, the growth looks good, though it is hard to make any judgment for sure. We have focused for now on those who did not make growth, and schools have identified those students as a hot list for support. So again, they're really focused on individual schools and building the capacity of the individual schools to use data in an effective way. ELs attaining English proficiency. So these numbers, so they're dividing them up in relationship to indicators, just so you're clear about how they're organizing their thinking about this and their actual actions. So ELs attaining English proficiency. These numbers were analyzed at school levels with alignment between those attaining proficiency and those scoring high on other assessments, SAGE and DIBELS. Patterns were discussed and adjustments to systems were put into place. That is, teacher changes, schedule changes, interventions. So what they're doing is they're actually triangulating the data in relationship to identifying the ways in which students who have already attained English proficiency are then supported. So ELs who exit. We are in a 3-year of ESSA regs changing to a 4-year monitoring. This means we have not had any exit students for 2 years. This will be our first year, 2019, to having exited students. And I know just from knowing this group, they've spent an incredible amount of money in thinking really strategically about the way in which they're monitoring, and then in their PowerSchool system, they've made it electronic so that it's more accurate in relationship to how they're following up with students who have reached a 5 and based on their academics have exited language programs. 4, ELs meeting state academic standards during monitoring status. So you see how they're dividing the ELs into a variety of groups related to the way in which data are reported. We're currently developing a monitor plan for students, which will be ready in January. This is January 2019. Currently, EL supervisors are responsible for all 5s and 6s and monitoring academic needs at the end of each term. So I just want to point out that they don't let their students flounder after they have achieved English proficiency within the WIDA 5 and 6. So, and they've done this because they've put resources up in advance to think about the systems that they're developing. So it's beyond just a person, but it's the way in which systems are organized and how resources ensure that that happens. Now we have ELs who have not attained proficiency within 5 years of the initial classification. And of course, that's going to help when we actually get the data from USBE. We are aware that we have long-term ELs in secondary and have worked with those schools to determine needs of students who have been classified for a long time. So the issue around long-term English learners, it's very clear in the ESSA statute that there is a significant problem when you're in a school system and you haven't reached proficiency in just English by 5 years. And that's challenging, and the reason it's challenging is that we know from course-taking patterns in the historical data that puts an extreme pressure on elementary schools, and then the transitions between elementary and middle, and then obviously between middle and high school. And then they talk about working with their own tech department to really look at data from their own system. Okay, so this is taking longer than I thought because I'm trying to interpret and highlight the things that they've done that are systemic. They're changing systems. Now, when you focus on doing policies, procedures, and funding the change in a system, then that kind of support benefits the specific schools and teachers who are building their capacity to make better instructional decisions. Okay, so then we get to question 2. Describe your evidence-based model for instruction and the curriculum materials, elementary and secondary, that are supplemental to those with state and local funding. Now, I've sent out the evidence guidelines, evidence-based guidelines for what quality is different from scientifically researched criteria that was used with No Child Left Behind. And this, I think next week, the entire agency is doing work on that. And then I'll be doing a webinar to help you better understand what that looks like. Okay, so I'm going to skip sample one. Sample one is a great example, but I'll send it out to you. You know, it's about professional development related to the EL supervisor in each school, how they support at the building level, not only identification of students, but that they're actually ensuring the civil rights for all students. And that documentation related to understanding the civil rights of English learners is embedded in the monitoring tool, where you assess yourself honestly. So it doesn't help to fudge and say that you know, you've implemented something successfully if there are no student outcomes that in some way validate that assessment. So there's no shame in, you know, being in progress, right? You're in progress and you're working on changing systems. Instruction talks about highly qualified teachers, the professional development they do. They talk about Tier 1 instruction, small group instruction in Tier 1, reteaching and extension of vocabulary enrichment embedded in an actual context. You know, doing vocabulary based on parts of speech by looking at plurals in nouns and not embedding it in a context with no visuals is not quality instruction for English learners. It just makes no sense. And then you have Tier 1, small group instruction, Tier 2. They're aligned, again, to their specific needs. So it's not this like one size fits all, but it's really focusing on the needs of the students. And if you look at English language development, they're working on listening and speaking, reading and writing the English language. Secondary courses, they explain what they're doing, and then they list the materials that they use, and then they clarify that they're using supplemental funding, state at risk, and Title I funds that are used to support program services. So they're talking about the way in which they braid funds to ensure that students are receiving more differentiated support based on their needs. Sample 2, this is really an incredibly, as well, really detailed. So they're explaining that the executive leadership team in their district, they analyze all their resources, they look at how they allocate them, they look at the present impact, they focus on what the impact they want to be, they adjust the allocation of all the resources to meet the needs of the underrepresented, you know, student groups. And the way in which they do that is, again, they braid resources for effectively impacting the learning of EL students. And this is how they've done it. They describe the set-asides for the curriculum. They explain what the FTE does, how they document it with the float list. They use additional funding as identified in each school site plan in their funding section under goal area. They analyze the data. So they're saying, like, specifically, here are all these things that we're doing. They oversee the portfolio in each of their schools. They collect academic student achievement. So they're saying specifically, based on the question, which is the second question, in relationship to evidence-based support beyond the supplemental funding, right? Because that's really the point. When some people say things like, well, we really don't get enough funding in Title III, Well, the reason you don't is that it's supplemental. The way in which you use those funds can't supplant the civil rights obligations to provide equitable access for every single child, no matter what their language or their country of origin, a high quality instructional experience and equitable opportunities for, early college and career opportunities. So here's the question 3, explain how you allocate resources to individual students, specifically meeting the annual growth goals. This includes instructional coaches, resources. So I'll just do one, which is the first one. This goes back to this idea of the individual school writing an EL plan, setting goals, looking at the needs, looking at ELD growth using WIDA access. EL supervisors and coaches are trained monthly to support classroom teacher to meet these school growth and professional goals. So it's always about developing a baseline for the work that is being done. So that's question 3. Now, if you're a charter school, because it says because this focuses on a district and how they allocate funds to individual schools. So in the most recent revision, I changed it so that charters, if they just have one school, if an LEA is a charter and they have one school, whether it's 2 campuses or not, the important thing is to focus on every grade level and identify what the issues are. And the reason I'm saying this is, we've gone to schools and done visiting, and, it's really interesting. I mean, it's really incredibly a learning experience for all of us when, and you can be a part of the peer review process. But you might go to an elementary school and they're 3 third grade teachers, and like one is, kind of a math rock star, the way in which she, or sometimes it's a he, that really provides quality instruction in mathematics that's well scaffolded, that has, like 70–80% of student talk, is, organized in a very systematic way, has small group instruction, and then you'll walk into the other classrooms and there's a distinct difference, but it's the same grade level. So then the question is, how are people using grade level PLCs to really model and create observation opportunities based on student data and based on the learners to see how teachers are becoming more and more skillful in the kind of work that they're doing in making grade level content accessible. Here's question 4. List specific schools that did not meet the interim goals. So the reason I'm focusing on this is that, again, it depends on how a district is allocating funds based on data to support specific schools. It would be also the way in which charter schools look at their data and they look at the proficiency level of the students and they think about how they're going to support level 1 and level 2 kids in a way, and not by putting them on computers. I've seen some examples of kindergarten students, being put on computers and not having any kind of oral language development, not to mention the English learners that are there. So the goal really is to analyze the data, to engage the families. Family engagement is one of the critical issues that we've seen that has the most significant impact on what happens with English learners. And so I've seen family literacy centers, learning centers, community centers, where they provide all kinds of support services for refugees, immigrants, and English learners that are really exemplary. So here's question 5. And remember, I'm going to send these out to you so that you can see that wherever you are in the process is okay. the question is, how are you using data to evaluate the effectiveness of your program for which students in which grade levels at which school? And then how do you reallocate and grade resources to ensure that the needs of those students are met? And how do you support teachers in doing that, as well as principals? You know, the job of a principal is really incredibly challenging. But moving away to a manager instead of an instructional leader is problematic, especially for English learners, because they are the lowest performing group, lower than, when you look at the data, and the dropout rate, highest dropout rate, it's 28%, which has actually gotten lower in the last 5 years, but still incredibly unacceptable. So the last question is, it's a budget narrative. Explain how funds are being used to supplement programs and activities primarily funded by state and local funds. Base your explanation for funding allocations on your previous responses, focusing on student learning outcome data, the 5 indicators, and evaluating program effectiveness. So this whole application is trying to support you in getting feedback, in making a case for the way in which you look at student needs and student growth toward proficiency and access to grade level content to better allocate funds. So here's one sample. Funds in school plans must be aligned and targeted to. Okay, so they have school plans, and so those funds have to be aligned to these 3 key indicators for Title III, which is English language acquisition, which focuses on instructional assistance and curriculum, professional development, and parent engagement. They're based on needs, and the goals are set for growth. Funds to support include not just Title III, but Title I, state at risk, local funds, school land trust. So it's a way in which they braid the funding. So they're pretty clear about what school plans need to be. So then here's another sample. It says, please refer to our equity and access funding guide. So they uploaded the document to actually show you the way in which equity funding and access resources are guided by the district's work with individual schools. Please see my earlier responses in this document regarding funding resources and braiding resources. So these are really clear examples of what it means to be very thoughtful and strategic and systematic in allocating instructional coaches based on some kind of criteria that you develop. You know, working with paraprofessionals so that they become skillful in the sense of really effectively targeting students for extra support. Now, I've seen some amazing groups, and the way in which the school day is organized, the English learners that have extra support are usually level 1 and level 2 students. I've seen this at the high school level, I've seen it at the elementary level, and it makes a significant difference. Ultimately, the question is, how do general education teachers design their instruction so that the content at the grade level is comprehensible and well scaffolded? You know, I've seen some of the best instruction in an 8th grade math class with probably about 10 or 15 different languages, refugee students, where there's total physical response, there's graphics, there's visuals, there's film, there are whiteboards for checking for understanding in relationship to the area and the way in which that's organized for, you know, understanding what the Pythagorean theorem actually means. So one of the things that we've done when we visit is we give feedback in relationship to the lack of cognitive rigor that we see happening with students who are English learners. You know, worksheets given out with a little explanation or a little follow-up, independent work based on, you know, times when students have headphones on and they're doing computer, you know, work on the computer. Now, a computer is simply like a pencil. It's just a tool. So the question is, how does a student develop oral language? How does language acquisition happen for them embedded in actual context where they can talk about what they're learning with their peers or with students whose language of English proficiency is higher than theirs? So I'm hoping that this has been helpful. I've gone over 5 minutes. I'll send this out to you, and then most of the applications have been approved for 2018 and 2019. We did 2019 first because that's where the 2 documents were uploaded, the application and the monitoring tool. I wanted to make sure that I gave you feedback. I emailed you clearly, and I'm hoping that this webinar will support you in thinking in a way to really revise and use these tools to help you more effectively use resources. And remember, the 2018 budget, so the application and the monitoring tool, all of that has to be applied, revised if necessary, and approved by me. And if you have any more questions, email me, and then we can, you know, talk over the phone, or I can give you examples. I'll send this out. Because you have money for 2018, 2019, but you can't ask for reimbursements until the application in the grant system is approved. And remember, you can't use 2018 money until you've used 2019 money until you use 2018 money, which means that you have to be really thoughtful in how you're using funds, and when you expend those funds, whether it's on salaries or benefits or whatever it is that you're doing, based on the allowable expenditures to ensure the growth of English proficiency and growth and proficiency toward academic content, you know, as soon as those services are provided, then, you know, the important thing is every quarter to ask for reimbursements with the appropriate, you know, receipts and invoices and explanations for how you're spending funds related to your application, you know, relating to the goals that you're setting. So this is an attempt to help you to scaffold your experience of really using your funds more effectively. Because at the end of the federal fiscal year, which is not divided into 2 years, but USBE has divided into 2 years. So you can't wait for 24 months anymore to spend money, which is a really serious problem when you're caught at the last minute and the 2016, 2017 funds haven't been expended, and then we have to send it back to the federal government. So I'm trying to provide the system, the support, and the structure to help you make better decisions related to the way in which funds are braided, resources are used that have an impact on progress for English learners. Well, thank you so much, and I'll send this out to you probably on Friday. That'll give you, or maybe when I go back to the office right now, I'll send it out to you with a caveat about, you know, really making sure that you have everything ready to go, and I can make sure everything is approved by December 1st. Thank you so much.